In 1431, the church burns a 19-year-old girl alive as a heretic in a French marketplace. 25 years later, that same church reopens the case and admits, in writing, that it was wrong. Her name is Joan of Arc. A farm girl from the village of Domremy who claimed to hear the voice of God, led a French army, and broke an English siege at just 17. She crowned a king at Reims Cathedral. Then that same king did nothing while she fell into enemy hands outside the walls of Compiègne, captured by Burgundian soldiers allied with England. 2 trials judged this one woman. One court sentences her to death. 25 years later, a second court clears her name completely, point by point. We're walking through both, side by side. Trial 1, Rouen, France, 1431. Joan sits chained in an English-held fortress, guarded by soldiers day and night instead of nuns, as church law required. This is not really a religious court. Trial 2, France, 1455, ordered not by England but by the Pope in Rome. This time Joan herself is not the one on trial. The verdict is: 25 years after the fire, the church asks a question no one expected: did we execute an innocent woman? And the person forcing that question is not a soldier or a bishop. It is Joan's own mother, an elderly, illiterate peasant named Isabelle Romy, who refuses to let her daughter be remembered as a witch. Here is how her fight changed the verdict. First, the judges. In 1431, the man running the trial is Bishop Pierre Cauchon, and he is being paid in English silver to deliver a guilty verdict before the trial even opens. Cauchon wants the wealthy archbishopric of Rouen for himself. England controls who gets it. A guilty verdict against Joan of Arc is effectively the price of his next promotion. He personally selects the assessor's several dozen judges, almost all loyal to the English Burgundian cause. Any clergyman who shows sympathy for Joan is quietly dismissed from the panel. Picture the room where this actually happens. Rouen in 1431 is not a neutral city, it is an English military stronghold, its castle garrisoned by English soldiers, its streets patrolled by an occupying army. A trial unfolding inside those walls, watched over by the very power that wants Joan dead, can never really call itself impartial. The judges wear the robes of churchmen. The soldiers standing outside the door wear the colors of England. So when a guilty verdict comes down inside these walls, ask yourself, is that a judgment of conscience, or a judgment delivered under guard? Now meet the second judge, from 1455, Inquisitor General Jean Brihel. He answers to the Pope in Rome, not to any king, and his job is the exact opposite of Cauchon's. Brihel spends months traveling across France gathering evidence: Rouen, Orleans, Paris, even Domremy, Joan's home village, interviewing soldiers, priests, and people who knew her as a child. Notice what Brihel chooses to do differently. He does not simply reread old paperwork from a desk in Rome. He rides out into the French countryside himself, tracking down the people who were actually there. A slower, harder path than reading a file, but the only one that could produce an answer nobody could later dismiss as secondhand or convenient. Why go to that much trouble for a woman already 25 years dead? Because a real verdict has to survive more than one telling. 2 judges, 2 masters. One serves a king who needs Joan dead to protect his conquest of France. One serves a church that simply needs to know the truth, whatever it costs. Same accusation, same set of facts, completely different judges appointed by completely different powers. That alone should tell you which verdict is worth trusting more. Now, the charges. In 1431, Joan faces 70 separate counts of heresy, later narrowed down by the court. At the center of what remains are 2 accusations that will decide her fate. First, she claims to hear voices from God Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret instructing her to save France. Cauchon's court insists this can only mean witchcraft. Second, she wears men's clothing armor, a soldier's tunic, cropped hair while living among an army of men. In 1431 France, the court treats that as a crime against nature itself. Joan explains the clothing is practical. She is a teenage girl sleeping among soldiers, armor protects her from assault. The court records her answer, then sentences her to death anyway. Now jump to 1456. Britel's court re-examines these exact same two charges: the voices, the clothing, this time using qualified theologians instead of judges paid by an occupying army. On the voices, the theologians rule that claiming religious visions is not automatic heresy. Dozens of recognized saints throughout church history claim to hear and see exactly the same kind of thing. On the clothing, the new judges rule it was simple practical necessity for a soldier in a war camp, not a sin, noting Joan never once claimed the clothes made her holy. The 1456 court adds one more finding. Testimony reveals the official transcript of 1431 did not accurately reflect what Joan actually said under questioning. Same two charges, same underlying facts. In 1431 they end in fire. In 1456 they're ruled meaningless. The evidence never changed. Only the honesty of who was judging it did. Now, the witnesses. In 1431, Joan has none. No lawyer, no advocate, no character witness, nobody from her side is ever permitted to speak on her behalf. She is 19 years old, alone, questioned for weeks by trained theologians using legal traps she was never taught to recognize, in a language built for catching her out. One question nearly finishes her instantly: "Are you certain you are in God's grace?" Yes traps her as arrogant. No traps her as damned. She dodges it and it barely saves her. By total contrast, in 1455 and 1456, Britel's court formally calls 115 sworn witnesses. Soldiers she fought beside. Village priests. Childhood friends from Domremy who watched her grow up. Her old military commander testifies for her. Her personal confessor testifies for her. Villagers describe a devout, ordinary, hard-working girl nothing resembling the witch described in 1431. Even members of the original 1431 court staff now testify under oath, admitting judges were threatened into compliance and official records were quietly altered before anyone outside Rouen ever saw them. One notary of the original trial testifies, on the record, that the written transcript did not fully or accurately capture Joan's actual answers under questioning. Another witness describes English soldiers openly threatening any judge who dared show leniency, warning them they would be drowned in the Seine River if Joan somehow walked free. One trial, total silence for the accused. The other, over 100 sworn voices speaking in her defense. That is the entire difference 25 years and an honest court make. Now, the verdicts. May 30th, 1431, Rouen Marketplace, France. Joan is led out in front of a gathered crowd, tied to a tall wooden stake above a pile of kindling. She is 19 years old. The fire is lit beneath her. Witnesses later testify that her final word, repeated over and over as the flames rise, is simply the name Jesus. Afterward, English officials order her ashes swept directly into the Seine River, so nothing physical remains, no bones, no relics, nothing her followers could ever gather around or venerate. They want Joan of Arc erased completely, permanently, from French memory. Instead, by trying to erase her, they create the very mystery that keeps her story burning for the next 25 years. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. Now, verdict 2, July 7, 1456. A different room, a different generation, a different standard of evidence entirely. The court gathers to read its final ruling aloud, in public. The ruling declares the 1431 trial was riddled with fraud, deception, and serious errors of fact and law. Every single count against Joan of Arc is formally nullified. The church that burned her now officially, publicly calls her innocent and orders a memorial cross erected at the exact spot in Rouen where she was executed. Same woman, same underlying facts, 25 years apart. One court sentences her to fire. The very next generation of judges declares she was innocent from the very beginning. None of this happens without one woman who refuses to let her daughter's name stay a heretic's name forever, Isabelle Romee, Joan of Arc's own mother. After the execution, Isabelle is already in her 50s, illiterate, poor, a peasant woman with no title, no money, and no legal standing inside the church whatsoever. For over 2 decades she petitions anyone willing to listen, local priests, visiting nobles, eventually messengers to Rome itself, begging them to reopen her daughter's case. In November 1455, now in her 70s, Isabelle travels to Paris and kneels weeping before church officials at Notre Dame, holding out a written appeal for her daughter's justice. Pope Calixtus III finally agrees to act. In 1455 he formally authorizes the new inquiry that becomes the nullification trial, the very trial that overturns the guilty verdict. Isabelle Romee lives just long enough to witness the verdict announced in July 1456. Her daughter has been dead for 25 years. But her daughter's name survives because she never stopped fighting. Isabelle dies roughly 2 years later, in 1458. Having spent nearly a quarter-century of her life on a singular goal, clearing her executed daughter's name. 2 fates, 1 family. The daughter burns at 19, powerless and alone. The mother lives on, old and poor, and wins the exact fight her daughter never lived to see. The nullification trial doesn't undo the fire. Joan of Arc is still dead. But it permanently rewrites how history, and the church itself, remembers her. In the centuries that follow, she becomes a symbol of French resistance invoked during wars and revolutions, and again centuries later during both world wars. In 1920, the Catholic Church pushes the reversal even further. Pope Benedict XV formally canonizes her, officially declaring Joan of Arc a saint of the Church. The same institution that burned her alive as a heretic now prays to her as a saint. Very few reversals in the entire history of any institution are that complete. Today she is a patron saint of France, honored with a national holiday every May, nearly 600 years after a fire that was supposed to erase her forever. The English wanted her ashes scattered in a river and forgotten within a generation. Instead she has a feast day, a sainthood, and a trial record still studied by historians. 2 trials, 25 years apart. 2 opposite verdicts. 1 woman. The same church that condemned her to burn is the church that later admitted, formally and publicly, it was wrong. Historians still call it one of the only times in the medieval church's history that it fully retried, and fully reversed, one of its own death sentences. Most people only remember the fire. Almost nobody remembers that the church put its own trial on trial 25 years later and lost. So here's the real question: does justice even count, when it finally arrives 25 years too late for the person it was supposed to save? Tell us below.